Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about drones and all of the things that are in the media and literally in the air. And to discuss it with me today as we kick off the new year is Johan Vermij, part of our analyst team. Johan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to be back.
It's great to have you on, especially with all of the media excitement that's going on about drones. And for those of our listeners that are not familiar with it, a little bit of background. There is significant, excitement, anxiety about drone sightings that have been taking place or what are being identified as drone sightings, maybe potentially UFO sightings across New Jersey. And this has been going on since really, I guess, sometime October, November. And there have been escalating levels of concern about it. And as we often see in situations with drones and other aerial phenomena, a lot of confusion about what's real, what's not, a lot of the different aspects of where this all plays out. I do want to bring to the fore, there is this question about whether or not this is an alien invasion. It does seem like anytime we wind up with a situation with a lot of unknown atmospheric phenomena, things happen. And it's not the first time, I'll point out, that this has happened in New Jersey. Now, granted, in 1938, when Orson Welles was doing War of the Worlds on Halloween Eve, that was a situation that it raised a huge amount of panic. People were concerned that there was a real alien invasion going on. But he did identify that there were lights in the sky. Johan, what are your thoughts? Are aliens finally communicating with us?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to say that the chances of anything coming from Mars are 1,000,000 to 1.
More than 1,000 to 1. I make the joke because, of course, this was one of those things in the speculation in the radio show. They were saying 1,000 to 1. There was no chance it was ever going to be Martians. But I think at least at this point, we have probably some more terrestrial originating ideas about where that may have come from.
Yeah, and it's always confusing that the types of people like the flat earthers are the first to believe in UFO stories. But actually, there's been proper investigation into these sightings, and the vast majority actually has FAA-compliant lighting. So it's probably more likely that the majority is just planes. The New Jersey skies they're pretty much flying wing to wing.
Right. It's a busy airspace, right?
Yeah, it's a busy airspace. But nonetheless, if you're looking at drones, there's a good chance that a part of it is kind of your friendly neighbor flying a drone trying to snap some pictures of his neighbor, or that it's a nation state doing some spying on military installations. In the wider geopolitical context, of course, we have the war in Ukraine. In recent months, we've seen many different drone sightings close to Norwegian oil rigs in the Baltic Sea. We've seen drones surveilling the Ramstein airbase in Germany, in the Lakenhals airbase in the US, in the UK. And of course, there's the drone sightings in the US.
Yeah, no shortage of both coasts. We've got naval facilities on the East Coast. We've got, and in these cases, they actually found individuals flying the drones, and there have been arrests. And it does seem like this is military surveillance. In the two cases that have been significantly publicized, there happen to be ties to China for some of the surveillance. Certainly, there are other potential capabilities. And it's not as though these areas in New Jersey where the sightings have happened are devoid of interesting military facilities as well. There's an awful lot that's around these areas, too, that it might be useful for someone to surveil. And then, of course, there's also the other piece that, as you pointed out, once this thing gets going, there are cases in which people have identified that I'm going to go fly my drone to see if I can see those drones or aliens or whatever, which just adds to the confusion.
Absolutely. But I think the real question here is if we look at those nation states trying to put everything they can to their advantage, whether it's with drones flying around naval bases, whether it's the increasing acts of sabotage, for instance, the in the Baltics, the internet cables and power cables that are being constantly sabotaged by Russia and China, the cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, on utilities and power companies. We always have those advanced persistent threats, APT groups that are allegedly connected to this or that nation, but we never do the proper attribution because in these cases, real attribution is a problem because if you do the attribution, you have consequences. And that's something that we as an industry need to think about. How do we protect ourselves against these things?
Well, you raise a really interesting point, which is that drones have now shifted this equation a bit. And in terms of making attribution more complicated, maybe we should do a quick dive into some of the details of drone technology. Because one of the things I thought was also interesting coming out of so much of what was going on, or still is going on, is that there is this constant questioning of why don't we know that what they are, who they are, where they're from? Why is it that we haven't been able to figure all this stuff out? And if we think about a lot of what we've had for detection technologies for aerial borne threats, drones quite literally fly under the radar and are much harder to identify.
Absolutely. I think the drone technology has evolved immensely during the past 2 years, driving prices down. I mean, if we're looking at Operation Desert Storm in Afghanistan in the years after, I think the US has set the gold standard with the MQ-9 Reaper in terms of being like a large but very expensive military drone, price tag 30 million plus, with surveillance capabilities and the ability to fly at great heights and great distances and still carry payloads of significant size. If you're looking at the war in Ukraine, you see it's changing. I mean, the Russians started out sending like cheapy Shahed drones from Iran, still with a significant price tag of 100K, but I bet you could build it yourself at probably less than 5K. But the majority is now the FPV drones at $500 or 750 if you have thermal cameras on it. There's been so much innovation in altitude, in range that they can fly, and in navigation, whether it's AI driven mesh or FPV. There's a lot of jamming. There's a lot of innovation in decreasing the radar cross sections. In all these cases, it's like a trade off between how far you want to go and how much you want to carry. It's the trade off between battery and bomb, so to say.
Well, and this is the interesting thing. It's trade-offs also when we think about the detection technology, because you were talking about FPV drones, the first-person viewer, and that's a classic consumer-level drone. It's something where you've got a video link to a camera on the drone, and the person on the ground is piloting the drone and actually sees what the drone sees, that first-person view. And it goes up from there into those next levels of drones that have got a fair amount of autonomous control, that maybe using GPS to go places. We talk now about the next big step, especially in the US, in terms of regulation. Right now, regulations predominantly require that you actually be able to see the drone itself. You have to be able to keep your eyes on it. And we're getting into that next stage of approvals for beyond visual line of sight, BVLOS, and getting to drones that are starting to navigate on their own. But this is something that, in terms of military uses, that autonomous drone piece has advanced pretty rapidly. for better or worse, nothing like a significant conflict to drive innovation. And we're to a point, I think, also from the detection side that radar, you talked about smaller radar profiles. A lot of radar has actually been built with filtering technology to remove what gets referred to as clutter for things like insect swarms and birds and things that clearly are not a target of interest. Now, of course, that we've got smaller things flying in the air, those are targets of interest. And yet a lot of that detection technology is really built specifically to filter out the kinds of signals that they happen to generate. Again, more things that are changing, but another interesting transition in terms of what this shift in expectation winds up having driven. This really winds up being this very interesting shift of an advancing set of expectations, a shifting set of risks, and it gets right back to all of those regular straight up security questions of how do I change what my threat model is? How do I then figure out, put detections and mitigations in place to actually manage it? It's a constant evolution.
To your point, Eric, absolutely right. As an example, of course, FPV drones, $500, used extensively on the front line to incapacitate tanks and artillery. But beyond the immediate front line, if you look up the Ukrainian Nemesis unit, they've used $500 drones to destroy $1 billion S-300, S-400, NEBA-M, Akashuka radar and electronic warfare complexes. So it's $500 can eliminate 5 million.
Yeah, we're right back into the kind of asymmetry that you look at asymmetric forces. To your point, you've got this what is a very low cost option to inflict significant amounts of impact. And in New Jersey, you've got who knows what's up there, creating huge amounts of public concern and again asymmetry that anyone on the offensive side always wants to be able to leverage that kind of asymmetry and put it to work to their advantage. It's been interesting looking at some of the mitigations that are out there. Granted, detection is hard. I think a lot of the things that we've tried to identify are things like the radio signatures. So if you can see the command and control link for the drone, then you could detect it and potentially capture the link or at least disrupt it. We're seeing now more and more GPS spoofing, a direct result of the fact that now you have autonomous drones that are relying on GPS. They have a pre-programmed track. They don't need remote control after they're launched. They just simply follow that GPS track. So now you've got GPS disruption that's happening because defenders expect that, well, if we confuse the GPS signals, make the drone thinks that it's somewhere that it's not, it'll head it off into at least somewhere beyond its intended target.
Absolutely. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Ukraine, and on December 13th, I think there was a large attack by Russia sending, as I recall, 93 missiles and over 200 drones. And I was on the road, and suddenly my navigation was out because of all the GPS jamming to make sure that these drones wouldn't find their targets.
It's been interesting watching this level of capability ratchet up because then, of course, you've got folks flying drones who start to then shift to inertial navigation, which is the whole idea that you get pointed in about the right direction and then you manage where you are just simply by understanding the positional information, how fast is the drone moving, what direction is it in, and really just getting the feel for directionality and doing that sort of rough navigation that doesn't depend on GPS. If you get much more sophisticated, you have to have some sort of visual scanning, some sort of optical scanning to look at targets and terrain and things like that. But you can actually do pretty well with inertia. And now we're getting to a defender position in which you're starting to figure out how to mess with inertial systems. I thought an interesting thing I saw recently was talking about the attacks on the gyroscopes, which are the things that are the core of the inertial guidance. They basically help guide where the drone and used in many planes as well. But some of the inexpensive ones that are used in drones actually use micro machines, basically a tuning fork that's sitting inside a semiconductor device, MEMS gyros, or what they get referred to as. And someone's figured out that not only do they sit there and vibrate, but in fact, you can find a resonant frequency for them. And just with audio sounds, basically very powerful speakers, you can, if you find the resonant frequency, you can make the gyro malfunction because you get that tuning fork oscillating not at where it should be, but at a resonant frequency that simply sends the drone off into basically out of control. It's one of those things that we see so often in this sort of back and forth of offensive and defensive plays to try and sort this stuff out. It's a set of challenges when we think about where this has come through. And I think even more so when we start to ponder where it's headed.
I think the innovation, especially in Ukraine, goes at lightning speed. There's super short innovation cycles, like 8 weeks. And I think the Russians started off with the fairly rudimentary, basic Shahed drones. But in the last 2 years, they've innovated a lot and have improved their own special technology center in Zala aerospace drones. The Orlan, the Granat and Lancet drones have become much more sophisticated. But especially in Ukraine, there's innovation at lightning speed. And I think that even though the US has a tradition with Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and RTX, they're just not keeping up. I think currently, if it's not used in Ukraine, you're out of business.
Well, sadly enough, it does wind up being a proving ground for the technology. It's interesting seeing the recently Army contract, U.S. Army contract that was awarded an upstart who, to your point, was particularly successful because they had a lot of experience in real world conditions in Ukraine in terms of what they were building capabilities. It is that, unfortunate byproduct of all this is that there is, nothing better than real world testing, unfortunately. It's interesting to see some of maybe what the future looks like in some of this. Hopefully, again, we get beyond this war, in the relatively near future, and take a lot of what was learned and put that to work. Clearly, of course, it's going to be put to work in the battlefield. Everybody talks about, and certainly we now have movies depicting swarms of drones. Well, maybe we're not too far from that. But it'll be interesting to see where this goes in terms of civilian uses and some of these technologies that get put in place. Maybe this helps to build slightly more robust infrastructure. When we think about things like urban air mobility, and unfortunately, Zoe Roth, who covers that, wasn't able to be with us today, but a lot of Zoe's work in urban air mobility and Johan, a lot of the work you've been doing in terms of sort of drone, this seems to be an area where we're not too far from significantly greater densities of drones in the sky for civilian purposes, for things like delivery. We already are starting to see things like methane emission visibility, a lot of things that are domestic civilian uses for which drones can be significantly important as well. But that's going to change a lot of what our daily lives are like. We're not going to be seeing, we will probably still be seeing airliners overhead, but there'll be a lot more in the air closer to us, which I think will hopefully not cause the kind of panics we've been seeing in New Jersey.
Interesting that you say that. You still expect to see actual planes flying around. Looking back at a recent statement by Elon Musk saying that the military doesn't need jets anymore and just can do with drones after all. Looking at the reality is that if you talk to special forces in Ukraine, they say, hey, we can hear the drones coming. We've got our detection models. We can take cover. I don't care about grads exploding near me. I'm getting used to that. But the glide bombs, that's something they fear. Those are big modified fly bombs that glide. They're launched from planes. And you see that they're pretty much scared of that because it has such an enormous blast radius. And the only thing that can stop that are the F-16s that can hold the jets at bay that launch these glide bombs. So planes and fighter jets will not entirely be replaced by autonomous systems. Although, yes, to your point, we're seeing so much innovation. Over the past decade, we've seen autonomous systems. So I'm talking a little bit broader than just drones in our coverage. As we look at the digital transformation of industries, we're looking at robots and autonomous systems, which can be drones that can be used, as you said, for methane detection, but also increasingly used by utilities to do monitoring and inspections of power lines, or in the oil industry for flare monitoring. You're seeing the development of subsea drones that do underwater surveillance. The innovation is making the technology more accessible and more affordable. So we've seen the price of optical cameras go down a lot over the past decade. The batteries have improved, the drone technology itself, the navigation has improved. So those expensive MQ-9 Reapers are no longer just limited to the military that has a big budget, but there are cheaper ones like 100K that have pretty similar capabilities these days. And so you're seeing that there's an increase in use of these drones that have ISTAR inspection, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance capabilities by the border guards, by the sea guards, and public services, police and fire brigade are using drones to find victims in a fire. We're even seeing what we call biomimetic drones, like robot dogs, drones or robots shaped like a natural being, in this case, like a robot dog, that can walk into, for instance, a substation where you have a gas leak. So it's increasingly being used to access locations that have health and safety risks, but also in deploying drones into large geographical areas, such as utilities. If you're looking at the recent hurricanes in Florida, it's much cheaper to send out drones to do the inspection rather than sending field crews to inspect every pole. The business case is tilting because the price is going down and it's becoming cheaper than sending field crews.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. You mentioned first responders, like fire brigades. Is it? I think it was in Belgium. They're talking about using what's being referred to as drone in a box technology to be able to be basically to dispatch a drone when they get an alert, if there's been an accident, a fire, something like that, to get first eyes on the scene so that when the first responders are arriving, the drone's actually already been there, is hovering on scene, and can give them that quick situational awareness of, here's where these problems are. This one's knocked over a fire hydrant. There's water here. The smoke seems to be coming from over here. Basically, to get them that much more aware when they get on scene, which it's interesting because I know Nokia's participating in drone in a box technology, in which you can actually position drones that are at the ready around a city or a locale and dispatch them. It sort of says maybe we start to get towards that being a public utility, which is on demand. You've got the ability to be able to go get eyes on scene when there's situations that demand it. It really starts to shift some of that thinking in terms of how drones get leveraged and what that drone infrastructure even looks like.
Absolutely. And the example you mentioned is an interesting one because in Belgium, it was Nokia's first deployment, and they recently deployed, I think, some 250 drone in a box units in Switzerland as well as in their second project. And they're looking at it from a connectivity point of view based on 5G, obviously, as hopefully for them becoming the de facto standard. But if we're looking at the technology, connectivity is a thing, especially if you're looking at surveillance drones with optical cameras taking videos high resolution, the amount of data that gets absorbed by these cameras and these drones is increasing, and it has to be offloaded somewhere. So if you're looking at satellite connectivity, it's not as reliable as 5G, perhaps, depending on where you are, coverage. Ukrainian drones have been known to lose connection to the Starlink satellite. A lot of drone vendors are playing the LoRa or NB-IoT connectivity, which is fine if you don't need to send a lot of data. But if you're in a mine and using it to a drone to inspect a mine shaft, how does that affect your connectivity?
Not much satellite service in your average mine.
No.
It gets into these situations in which we've got these interlocking pieces of technology. We've got the drones are getting smarter, cameras are getting better, but that puts pressure on the connectivity. So the connectivity infrastructure has to get better in order to support it. We're getting back into, much like the offense, defense, security cycles, we're doing the same kind of things on the other end of this in the technology interlocks as well. It seems like we're right back where we started. Well, hopefully we're getting to situations in which we move beyond some of the excitement that's being caused in New Jersey and move towards more practical links. But we are at time. There's so much more that we could be talking about. So, Johan, we'll have to get you back on to discuss this in more detail, especially when we figure out which of the aliens is visiting New Jersey.
Yeah, my bet's on Elf.
Well, it's seasonally appropriate.
It's interesting to have a conversation about technology and not even talk AI.
We managed to avoid it until now, but all right. Well, next time we'll lead with AI just because AI. But anyway, this has been great. Thank you, Johan. Appreciate all the feedback.
Thank you very much. It was fun to do.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr for On Mediation, Kira Smith on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope your new year is starting off well. If you like the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, send us likes. We'd love it. And I hope you'll join us for our next episode where we head into our 200th episode. I hope you'll join us then because there is always something next in tech.